Yeah. Okay. Hello. Hi. I think we just have to start. You guys that are in the bar, you can just continue. I just make my introduction first. Happy New Year, everybody, and welcome to this season's first platform. We are proud to open this season with a big solo show of Christopher Williams. And we're very happy that he has accepted to give us an artist talk here before the opening tonight at 8 o'clock. For over 20 years, Christopher Williams has worked in the field between photography as art and the application of the photographic medium to documentation, advertising, and journalism. In the 1970s, Christopher Williams studied under pioneers of American conceptual art like John Baldessari, Michael Asher, and Douglas Huebler. This background of the American conceptualist art is an important background for understanding Christopher Williams' art. But in contrast to the text-based conceptualism of the 1970s, Williams has worked with images, and photography has been the core of his whole oeuvre. The exhibition in Bergen Kunsthall will be the first major presentation of Williams' work in Scandinavia. And it will also include a radio program, Radio Danielle, that Williams founded together with John Kelsey. The program will be broadcasted at Bergen Student Radio in 90 days ahead from now. During the exhibition, we will also arrange a live event here in Landmark. So you should follow our website and you should definitely be there. We will invite guests, both from Norway and internationally, and it will be recorded and included in Radio Danielle. Okay, so I'm not going to say more. We have Christopher here, so I'll just give the mic to him. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming, and thank you to the Kunsthalle for inviting me and for everybody who worked so hard on this exhibition. My plan was to do a walkthrough of the exhibition, but I was told maybe more people might show up, and indeed you did. So I'm going to kind of do a casual walkthrough using the PowerPoint, and we've got shots of each room, and I'm going to kind of go back and forth and talk a little bit about the photos. But I wanted to back up for just a minute and say two things, which is when I got out of college in 1980 or 81, I worked for a designer named Saul Bass in Los Angeles. He did the titles for Psycho and Vertigo and North by Northwest, and did the logo for the telephone company in LA, and a very well-known designer, at least in the States. And I was a film and slide archivist, and they would bring all the material that was produced during commercial shoots to the archive for me to file them. So they would bring the unused transparencies and the Polaroids and drawings and things for me to kind of order a little bit for each project and then put away. And one thing that I was impressed with, having been in art school, in art school I made some really, in terms of quality, in terms of traditional production value, some pretty terrible looking photographs. And what I was really impressed with the commercial stuff, because they were using large format cameras and really good lenses and everything, was the amount of information that they were getting on the take from the shoot. But I was always disappointed when I saw the final product, because they would airbrush it out or retouch it. So they'd take away the texture of the skin, and there was a reason for that. They'd generalize it and turn it into an image. But I always thought the raw stuff was more interesting. And it would be, I don't know, maybe almost 10 years before that would kind of click in as something that I wanted to take advantage of. But it was that, thinking back, that was a really important moment for me, because that kind of information promotes a different kind of seeing and a different kind of looking. And a few years ago, with the people that I work with, I threw out the idea that we should try to make something that's so detailed and descriptive that even people who weren't interested in the subject that we were working on would want to look longer at the picture. So I just didn't want to forget. And if there's some political subject matter in my work, but if my work is political at all, it's about trying to keep art as a place where intensified seeing can still happen and not super fast seeing. So I just wanted to start with that kind of comment. And so this is when you enter. Oh, and the name of the work is, for example, 18 Lectures on Industrial Society, which is the name of a book from the 60s that was about industrial society, obviously, but it was really about Russia and the United States, the superpowers, and oil and corn, and all of the things that they were trading. And it also was the basis of, or the inspiration for Jean-Luc Godard's film 2 or 3 Things I Know About Her. So I wanted to, the work that I had done prior to this work, I've been working on this for like 7 or 8 years, and the work I did before that was called, for example, Die Welt ist schön, The World is Beautiful. So I changed the work and wanted to change the title because for me, using for example implies that I could name a third book or a second book to refer to what I was doing. And I also like the idea that, because I don't think I'm lecturing, so I like the idea that I would call it like a lecture instead of a poem, let's say. So you enter the first space, and the first thing you see are these cameras, and it's 3 views of one camera, and I'll talk about it a couple of different ways. But in, for example, Die Welt ist schön, the self-reflexive aspect of the work was kind of outside of the frame. So when I changed to a new body of work, I decided to start with the kind of most direct, dumbest idea of self-referentiality, like it's a photograph, so show a camera. And so this is where I started. And I'll take you around the room, and then we'll go to the individual shots. And this is to the left of that and to the right. I'm going to skip this for now and this and go straight to these. I'm interested in boxes, and what a camera is basically a box with numerals and letters inscribed on it. It's a little box-like machine with letters and numerals described on it that, used by somebody with the knowledge to read those numbers and letters, will produce, quote, the correct kind of image. And I like the idea that of maybe displacing the photographer or displacing the artist and thinking that maybe the camera was possibly playing the person, or that the photographic industry was actually playing something out and the person was just a convenient way to realize its project. And I didn't read it, but I read about a book called The Desire of Botany, and it talks about how apples were not always red, but in order to make their population larger, they made themselves more attractive to people. So we got attracted to these red shapes and started helping them multiply. So the premise of the book is that the apples actually used us and not really the other way around. And I think the camera has a little bit of that aspect to it. And there are lots of like rings of determination. There's the designer of the cameras, the scientists who got involved with optics, the chemists who develop the film. And so I wanted to try to refer to all of those things in this body of work instead of the artist being the center. And not an expressionistic model of the artist, but a kind of somebody working with cultural facts, maybe. And what I'd like to do is just go through If I go too fast, it will short out. Okay, so then we move to this box. It's a German post box. It's called Packset, obviously, and it's another box with language and numerals on it describing what it is, and it's also, it describes how to use it or how to construct it, how to build it, and I think in a way it's very German, not to be critical of my German friends who are here, but the black lines that you see, the black rectangles that extend from the side to the top of the box, are guidelines for where to put the transparent tape. And so you can tell whether you've done a good job or whether you're precise. It suggests where you should put the tape, but it also is like an immediate report card to how well you've done staying inside of the lines. The text on the front tells you that it's a small box and that there are 5 other sizes of boxes that you could have. So you know where it is in its class of objects, and the big S also tells you that it's small. But my favorite feature is the tabs with the logo on it. And what really impressed me about those was that it's really something very private. The only people who see the tabs are the sender and the receiver of the object. So it's really something, and it basically goes within the box. So the people handling the object and the people who see it delivered on the desk actually don't see these nice little tabs. It's only the person receiving the package. Let's see. Oh, and the color, I don't know, I can't see from here how the color is, but the color is a little distorted, I think maybe because of the translation to the projector, but it approximates Kodak yellow. So when you go into the exhibition, you'll see that the yellows are all very close to one another. They can't, it's different kinds of film and different kind of printing, so they're not exactly like each other, but they're all within the ballpark of Kodak yellow. So people very often call this a film box and not a post box. They'll say, I like your picture of the film box. And the box itself is actually not really that close. I manipulated the color a little bit. Let's go. So this is another object with language and numerals inscribed on its surface. It's a tire, and all the like structural information about the tire, the type of tire it is, what kind of load it can hold, whether it's a summer tire or a winter tire, is all inscribed on the surface of the tire. So within the show, it doesn't tell you how to perform necessarily, but it's a slightly different class of objects than the camera and the pack set, but it's an object that bears an inscription that describes it. So within the exhibition, you'll see at least three types of photography. You'll see landscape or outdoor photography. You'll see studio work that gets close to portraiture, and you'll see tabletop photography of objects. And the tabletop photography comes from, it's kind of a hybrid of two things. The neutral field is used in advertising, but it's also used in traditional museum photography. And the level of detail comes from technical photography. Sometimes museum photography generalizes things a little bit too. But so that's kind of like the type of object that I was looking for. And I'll talk to you more about the selection of the tire. I might as well stay with the tire for a moment. Or no, I'll go back to the camera. And there are also three genres at work: still life, portraiture, and landscape. And each room has an example of each one of those things in it. Each room doesn't have a landscape, actually, but the other things are represented in each room. So another way of looking at the camera is, it's a Russian camera. It's not a Hasselblad. It looks like a Hasselblad at first glance. And I'm afraid we don't have close-ups of it, but you can see it soon. And it's a Russian knockoff of a Hasselblad. And when I'm looking for my subject, I knew I wanted a camera, but I didn't know what kind of camera. And if I didn't say it, this project is a Cold War period piece. I'm really thinking of it as a Cold War thing. And so I needed to start with the superpowers. I needed Russia and I needed the US. So I'll show you the US picture later. And the superpowers were a couple that generated the rest of the images in the body of work. So another way of looking at the cameras is not as some kind of technical object that performs people, but to look at it historically. And the camera was made in a factory called the Arsenal, which during the Revolution had a very significant strike take place. So it had one of the most important strikes of the beginning of the Revolution take place in it. 10, 15 years after that, I believe, I sometimes forget the duration, a well-known film called Strike by a famous Russian director was shot at the factory. And then years later, in the post-war period, it became a camera factory that made this. So this camera, it's not a great camera. I kind of think of it as Eastern cargo cult or something. But I like that the manufacture of weapons and the founding of the revolution and the construction of cameras all took place within one place. And many of the photos are slightly or subtly encoded with moments of social change. And so the history of this camera was interesting to me. And John Kelsey, I believe, writing, I think, in the catalog, and I don't know if you mentioned it, but we have just a couple of copies to show you of the catalog. But John Kelsey suggests that if you look up this, it's a Kiev 88, and if you look it up if you Google it, what you'll find is that it's such a bad camera that but the users love it, so they all help each other online solving problems. So he suggests that the socialist camera, even after the fall of the Soviet bloc, continues to produce a kind of socialism because all of these enthusiasts about the cameras are all working together as a group to try to make it work. And I thought that's not an idea I had, but I liked the train of thought. Okay, this is the American component to the Cold War couple, a still life with corn, and I didn't want to do oil, and corn seemed like a good direction to go in for a picture, and I wanted it to be an attractive picture too. So I started working with corn, and I read a book called Much Depends on Dinner. And in Much Depends on Dinner, they describe she describes a meal that consists of chicken, rice, corn, and a salad with olive oil and lemon. And the author claims that unless you're standing in the middle of Alaska or someplace in a very fresh river, catching a salmon with your bare hands, everything you touch has come in contact with corn. And it's a pretty big assertion. But in fact, it's kind of true. Corn is used as a lubricant. It's used as a preservative. It's used in the making of paper that wraps things. It's used in the making of fabrics, plastics, if I didn't say it. So this was really like, when I read this was really like an LSD-like vision, like everything has corn. And we have a lot of corn also. So I love this as a way of thinking. And then it sounds like a joke, but I started thinking, well, what percentage of corn is in photography? A modernist discussion, self-referential discussion about photography puts light as the primary thing, and I thought, why not put corn forward as the kind of primary element of photography at the beginning of this? So you have the camera and you have the corn, you have Russia, you have America, and then you also have the Kodak three-point reflection guide, which is a reference to old color printing, printing for reproduction, not necessarily for art. And so this could be very much like a product shot. And a lot of my source material was early color photography being done for advertising, where the technicians were shooting their own still lives just to work on the technique. And they always included these color bars and reflection guides to help guide them. And it's probably not visible in this format, but if you look, there's a copyright sign up there, and it says copyright Kodak 1968. So it was another way for me to include another moment of social change within this kind of post-war, Cold War piece. How am I doing for time?
Good.
How long do you think I've been speaking? 20 minutes? Okay. Okay, so again, the three-point reflection guide. I was looking at visual material, collecting visual material from Europe in the post-war period, and I was interested in the American influence on the restructuring of European culture. In cinema, it began with an interest in cinema, but then it spread to other things. And in the 50s and 60s in France, you started to have the introduction of luxury US machines, like big refrigerators and washing machines and things like that. And during wartime, butter and soap are a luxury. So there are all these images from that time period in film and in songs and in advertising about soap and shampoo. And so I got involved with shampoo and hygiene and a kind of reflection on hygiene. And for this photograph, and another thing too is that I was also, sometimes I construct things in a critical relationship to somebody else's work. And I was thinking about my colleagues who are serious artists, photographers, and I started to realize that nobody ever smiles. Like if you look at a Thomas Struth portrait, and I love his work, but nobody smiles. Or if you look at Sharon Lockhart's work, nobody smiles. Nobody really smiles in a Larry Clark photograph. So I decided to work with a smile, and there's a early critic of photography from the Frankfurt School named Siegfried Krakauer who uses the smile as a way of talking about the woman's smile in this photograph will always be visible, but you'll never know what produced it. And I thought that was a beautiful thing about the distance between the image and what actually happened. And I'm pretty sure I know what she's smiling about. She has a mole on her arm, and a mole right above her breast, and a mole on her cheek. And her towel kept slipping, and when I saw she had another mole, I said, let it stay, because then we have a triangle of moles, and that will lead to something else that you'll see later. And in most of these, I stand beside the camera, not behind the camera, because it really allows me to see things I wouldn't see if I was worrying about the technical parameters of it. So I can show you another example of something where I'm pretty sure I wouldn't have heard something if I had been sitting behind the camera. So anyway, I'll speed up because my timer is going to go off. I used Jacques Tati's casting description for the female lead of Playtime to find this model. And this was shot in Vancouver, and we went to a couple of modeling agencies and gave them this description, and then we kind of had a couple of casting days. And I was really unhappy with the quality of the work because it looked too much like fashion, contemporary fashion, but I wasn't figuring out why. And then I went to some of my source material, and I realized the models we were looking at were like 16 years old or something. They were teenagers, and they were what was being offered to. Oh, and Jacques Tati's description, he describes in detail, but he says the most important thing is that she carries herself like someone with a proper education, with a kind of dignity. So we were also looking for that, which lots of 16-year-olds don't possess that kind of poise yet. So everybody looked wrong, and I went back to the source material, and I realized that in the 60s and 70s, the models were not 16 years old, most of them. They were older. They were in their 20s. They were 30 years old. So we went for what's called lifestyle models, because 30 years old, unless you're a supermodel, is too old. And we found this woman. Her name is Miko. And they were saying she's hopeless, she's hopelessly too old, and whatever. And but she has a great smile, and she was fun to work with. And this is a good example of what I got, where you can see it when you look at the art in there. I'm not sure. I'm looking at it sideways, so I'm not sure if you can see it from here. But normally her veins and the texture of her skin and the kind of transparency of her skin would be taken care of now with Photoshop, then with airbrush and retouching. But that's really what I like about this picture, because it really shows you what her situation was like. And the towel, of course, is very green right now, but you'll see in the show that it's very close to Kodak yellow. And yeah, and the 3-point reflection guide is there, so you get the idea. Oh, and there are two. You'll see another. And this room is going to be an example, actually, of... This is a good example of the 3 types of photography that I told you about. In this room, you have a portrait, a tire, a picture of, on the left, of a flower stall in Cologne selling flowers. There. And a lens. So you have a technical image, tabletop image, you have a portrait, you have a tire, and then you have something referring to a work made outside of the studio. Another way to talk about the tires, which I wrote in a press release, is that I was reading about, well, I needed a tire. Like, how do I select an image? I needed a tire, and I was working with some of the people that I work with. They knew that I bought a tire, and I was interested in a tire for a couple of reasons. There's a German painter named Konrad Klappek who liked Lichtenstein's tires so much that he painted his own tire. And I like Klappek and Lichtenstein, and I thought I could use a tire, and it's a very common advertising image. And I'm also thinking about, I've been thinking about the reception of European pop art, so I thought a tire would really function in that way. The capitalist realists, Gerhard Richter, Konrad Lug, Klappek, Polka, and there are tires in their paintings, there are sausages in their paintings. So I was looking for a tire, and I had a contemporary tire, and then somebody that I worked with made a great suggestion. Because it's a period piece, They said, do you know that there are people who make vintage tires? They use the old molds and they make new tires that have the same formal qualities of the original tires. So then everything clicked in. And 10 years earlier, maybe 8 years earlier, I'd made a photograph of a Renault, a French car from the 60s, turned on its side in a studio. That image had started out as a barricade, a restructuring of a barricade image. But the more I worked on it, the more I decided it was too much like Jeff Wall. It was too much. It wasn't object enough. It was too theatrical for me. So I turned it into one car that I shot 11 times and would scatter throughout exhibitions. So I had a reference to a barricade in this show, but it was shot like a 60s car photograph or a product photograph, with the only exception being that the car was turned on its side. So then I just had the idea, what kind of tires would have been on the Renault that I had shot years before? So I had somebody helping me with research, and they found out the 3 most likely tires that would be used on that model Renault in 1968. So this is like a detail of a work from another body of work in a way. But in the research, and I can't substantiate this claim, but I also read in the same pile of information that the guy helping me with research found was that approximately 75% of the rubber used on the streets of Paris during the 68 period was Vietnamese rubber. And that was really a fantastic detail to me, that the French cars and eventually the French barricades would in part be produced by rubber taken from Vietnam. So that's another way of looking at the tire. So there's like a structural way of looking at the tire and a historical way of looking at the tire. For reasons of time, I'll cut to the next technical image. A couple of years ago, I got interested in dummies, prototypes, and show models. For right now, that will do, and cutaways. And everybody's probably old enough to remember, maybe not. They used to cut cameras in half for the camera shops. So it was like it was a 3-dimensional advertisement that would show you how complex the camera was. I like the idea of going inside of that box. Tools have become tools. You used to be able to see how a tool worked from the outside. Think of a hammer. But at least beginning with the camera, at the very least, and then, of course, ending up with the computers and cell phones, how they work, I mean, most of us don't really have a clue. It all happens inside of a box, and so I started collecting these cutaways so that I could show the inside of the object. And I also thought that was that's like an idea of a reveal, or a kind of modernist reveal idea. And so there are 2 kinds of cutters. There are the corporate cutters who work for the camera company. And you don't just cut a camera in half. Like we even looked into like a laser beam. I had the crazy idea like we can just buy cameras and use a laser beam. And somebody claimed we could. But actually what you have to do is take the thousands and thousands of pieces that make up a camera, and you have to cut each one in half. And each one is a different thickness and a different kind of material. So you need a different type of saw blade. You need different kinds of polishing material. So it really takes a long time to cut a camera in half. And then you have to reassemble it. So it really takes an organized mind to cut a camera in half. And then we found there was a great production person who worked at my gallery in New York who found a Dutch guy who had spent 2 years cutting a lens in half, almost 2 years cutting a lens in half. And he studied engineering, and he went to, it's not important for you to know this, but it's nice. He would go home every night. He worked in a lens factory, but he studied as an engineer. And he had a tutor who helped him with the structural tolerance of each kind of metal and all of this stuff. And so he either bought, borrowed, or found the equipment that he needed to cut a lens like this in half. And he would go home from work, and he worked in a lens factory, if I didn't say it. So this is a really interesting guy. And he went home every night and took a 20-minute nap and made a sandwich and put on music, and then started plotting how to cut the next piece in half. And we bought it from him. He didn't want to sell it. And sometimes there's a real difference between like money in the art world. A lot of times there's a difference between money in the art world and like money in like a hobbyist activity. And he said he wouldn't sell it. And I said, what if you thought of me like a patron and this money helped you cut something else in half? And he sold it to us for not so much money by the standards of art world production today. And I bought a few too many things that were cut in half, but it's a really interesting culture. And our studies also show that there are like, at the present we know that there are at least 8 cutters, amateur cutters in the Rhineland in Germany working, maybe even now. I mean, it's a Friday evening and those people are very involved with their cutting. And I did cut in half cameras also. Okay, I'll be maybe even a little quicker. All right, this is a very different kind of space. I didn't talk about 3 kinds of space, but this is a sheet of paper adhered to a ceiling panel, a dropped ceiling panel, and a lot of, in the last few years, a lot of artists have been getting back into a kind of material-based abstraction. Think of James Welling, for example. Tillmans is doing big abstractions. Roof is doing big abstractions. And there are now a lot of younger artists doing it, like Walid Beshti. And I thought I wanted to get involved with that. And most of them are working in a series, so I decided I want to make one kind of abstract picture. And so I did this. And what it is a ceiling tile by Daniel Buren. You probably all know Daniel Buren's work. He's one of the primary artists associated with institutional critique. And at a certain point in the 60s, he decided to only use stripes. And this is a relic from a show he did in California with a curator named Hal Glicksman at the Otis Art Gallery, which was one of the best art schools in Los Angeles at the time. And it was a work by Buren that referred to a work that Michael Asher did in Eindhoven a couple of years earlier. And it was all about installing and deinstalling and reinstalling ceiling panels and making the labor of installing and deinstalling visible, and using the frame of art as an artwork in itself to talk about the institution that frames it. But what you'll see when you look at the work in the space is, from a distance, like the long shot that you saw, it looks like an abstraction, maybe like a Sherry Levine or something like that, or it looks immediately like a Daniel Buren. But when you get up close, you can see that, and I think you can see it here, the edges are tattered, and there are dents in the surface of it. And so then I was thinking that it was related more to somebody like Aaron Siskin or or even Walker Evans. The whole tradition of photographing torn posters on walls, advertising on walls, billboards, things like that. So I think it's like a really reduced version of that kind of activity. And it's not a critique of my colleagues, but I only wanted to make one. And I won't promise that I won't make another kind of picture that refers to abstraction, but this relates to both those things in my mind. And also, biographically, I don't think it's important, but it relates to my history as an artist, because I studied with Michael Asher, and I knew Daniel Buren, and yeah, so the corn we talked about. Sometimes I start a book or an exhibition with this image, and it's a mobile. In the body of work before this, I also shot a mobile wall system. This is at the Secession in Vienna, the Vienna Secession, which is kind of an artist-run exhibition hall that has had great programming for years. And they have, in the 70s, an architect designed a mobile wall system for it. There's a grid on the floor, and you can put these very thin planes up because they're locked onto the floor. And I did an exhibition there with the Dutch artist De Rijk and de Rooij, and got the idea that this was a good system for me to represent. And I don't have pictures of it tonight, but then several years later, that interest continued into an exhibition that only displayed wall systems. It could have been called, it was in Bonn with the artist Matthias Palladen, and it could have been called a typological study of mobile wall systems in use in the Rhineland at the moment. We borrowed walls from other museums. So I made this photograph, and it's a way of kind of just making a light reference to the type of space you're in. And in fact, the ceiling in the Kunsthalle here is very similar to the ceiling at the Secession. Okay, my 30 minutes is up. Okay. Yeah, we only have a couple things more to talk about, so where should we go? Really briefly, just so you have something in your mind when you see the show. This is a French motorized bicycle called a Villa Solex. And I didn't go into it a lot, but I collect lots of pictures while I'm thinking about making other pictures. I want to see how other people make things. I'm not interested in a unique picture. I'm interested in something that refers to other pictures. And the common thing about a camera is that you're supposed to technically overcome it, and then it becomes a slave to your mastery and your subjective vision. And I would rather let the camera guide me and other people's pictures guide me. And one thing that I found, I'm interested in Vietnam and Africa, or I have been. And one thing I kept seeing is that in books in Vietnam and in Africa, this bicycle was appearing. So it's like, why is this bicycle appearing in both these places? And the answer is clear. It's the French. And so they were sent there initially for the colonialist agents to use to get around, and then eventually were handed over to the local population. So I did a version of this with 3 shots that were very much like they could have been in a bicycle advertisement, or no, a catalog description, I would say. And then I did 2 studies like this that I think relate more to Picabia or kind of modernist, maybe even Weston or something like that. But these are just called, the 2 of these are called Untitled Study in Black Vietnam, Untitled Study in Black Africa. Do you know which one this is, Doro? Afrique. Okay. Okay, so maybe this is a good place and then we can have some questions if you like. The way that I work with objects is very programmatic, except for those compositional studies. The field is almost always a similar color. It's changed a little bit with the black and white work lately, but it's always this neutral gray, or this very light gray. It's not white, the field, it's got tone in it. And the objects are almost always the same size. And I choose, if I can show it with one shot, I show it with one shot, like the cutaways. If it needs to be shown to understand the object, if it needs to be shown from several sides, then I do it from several sides. The work with people that I do is really different. Because people don't behave the way that objects do, or that's not the way to say it. But anyway, I wanted to make a shot with lingerie. And here you can see in the show, her label has, again, information about the thing. It tells you what size it is, it tells you what the material it is, it tells you how to treat it. But I think we initially hired this woman, we were going to photograph her feet, if I remember correctly. I mean, we did photograph her feet, but we were going to photograph her feet in shoes. And I was looking through her book, and in every picture, suddenly one picture appeared, and I saw the moles. And I thought, in all her other pictures, the moles had been removed, and a black and white, more arty photographer had left the moles in. So I wanted to try to do something beyond the shoe photograph with this woman, because I thought the moles were interesting. I liked the lingerie because it's the most it's like a diagram. It's the drawing of the lingerie in the catalog almost looks like the lingerie, because you have the outlines of the shape, and there's no ornamentation or lace or anything. So I thought this was great because it's so reduced. I was also thinking about I grew up in the period that I'm trying to describe, and there were these great camera manuals that teenagers collected that told you how to light a subject, but always used a woman in a bikini as the subject. So when you're like 15 years old, this is a great find in the used bookstore, because you have all of these women posing like this, and you can justify your activity because you can say that you're studying how many lights to use in a photograph like this. I was also thinking of Picabia's work, so like these photo manuals, and those things are not far apart, because Picabia, when he was doing stuff like that, was painting popular culture or painting kind of kitsch images. But this is a really good example of when sitting beside the technical crew searching for a subject, I found something that I might not have found. And I can't say that I wouldn't have found it, but it's what makes the picture for me. The moles are great, and she has moles, you can see, from above her ear all the way to her feet. She just has moles everywhere. And and one thing before, the other thing is that you can see next to her right breast there are these clips, and the lingerie was too big for her in that part of her body, and it's very common to use like these paper clips to make the clothes fit better, or be, to fit tighter. And the stylist on the shoot had a box of these clips, and I realized that there were yellow clips in there that were the right color yellow to string it out through the rest of the images. So I quickly decided that the clips would become a part of it. But then the thing that really made it a work, because I don't accept everything that we try when I'm working with a model, is the stylist said, "You've got to clean her feet, it's terrible." And I looked at her feet, and I remembered these beautiful paintings by Courbet, his nudes, that are in a way not unrelated to Picabia, where the women have dirty feet. And that's a reference to Italian painting where the women have dirty feet, because at a certain point, everybody had dirty feet, I think. And so she's got dirty feet. let me just make sure. I should say one thing. This is Mustafa. It's going to take too long, so I won't talk about it, but it's an example of a kind of collage without scissors. It's a very specific camera made in the Rhineland that's no longer in manufacture and is a collectible. It's a shirt by a company that Marcel Brotars did an ad for in the 70s for Der Spiegel. And it's a guy from Africa that we found on the street in Berlin. And again, bringing in a smile. And I just thought I had too many images of these white women in the thing, so I just thought, why not do the bluntest thing possible and bring an African into the picture. And I know what he was smiling about too. So questions? Anybody?
So are there any questions?
The other thing is, if you don't have questions, we're going to be hanging around. It's an opening, so you can also ask me something later. Is there something I didn't talk about that I should have talked about? No? Okay. Radio Danielle is, well, Salvine said it, a collaboration with John Kelsey from New York. John is an artist and a writer and a gallerist. He helps manage a collective called Rena Spalding. It's a fictional gallerist, and it's a group. It's a kind of a big group of artists, but it's really Emily Sandblatt and John Kelsey who run it. And a few years ago, I did a show in Bologna, and they wanted me to do a radio program in response to, we were talking about Bologna in the 70s, and they wanted to know how I knew about it when I was in college. And I said that the band Scritti Politti, a post-punk band, their first single, I believe, was called Skank Block Bologna. And at the time, bands were using the music as a kind of like newspaper to talk to all of us who were listening to the music about what was going on in different subcultures around the world. So there was this thing that all's not lost, something interesting is happening in Bologna. And not soon after that, Semiotext, a New York publication, published writings about the student movement and the radioactivity in the streets of Bologna. So they wanted me to do something, and I turned it down the first time because the Italian radio was really about local politics. They would say, don't go to such and such a corner, the police are there. And, so it was a way of alerting people to what was going on. And I can't, as an outsider, I can't go from Los Angeles to Bologna and tell them what their lives are about. So I turned it down. But also, it was called Radio Alice. And also Radio Alice had good music, and they partied a lot. And so it also sounds like, I've listened to the recordings, and it sounds like they really had fun. So within their political rants and their reportage, they also played music and drank, and it was a really interesting time and it was pirate radio, if I didn't say it. So I turned it down, and then I got the idea. They said that you're a quick quitter or something like that. And then I thought, well, it doesn't have to have the same function. And everybody almost all artists want to do radio programming. Only one very grumpy person said no. We've asked over 60 people, and everybody but one man said no. And one has left us, but most people are happy with the way that it went. And so we started to organize it. Or I invited John, and I invited John because John is involved with the New York music scene personally or socially. I listen to a lot of current music being produced, but I'm not part of the downtown scene, and he knows all the bands and stuff. So because we wanted music to be involved, not just artists. And so I invited John to participate. And first we were doing it like a group show because we didn't understand radio. We were going to pick like 6 people. And then we realized 6 people fill up. Time is really expansive. Space is finite, and time is really hard to fill. So it suddenly got really open, and we would just invite people we felt were interesting. And once we invite a person, if they ask our opinion, we'll give the opinion of the idea, but we don't want to. The only person who can stop something from being played is like the local city government. So that's the only censorship that we'll do if they come and shut down the radio station. But nothing is that offensive. They told us in Bologna not to make fun of the mayor, and in our jingles we actually did make fun of the mayor, but nobody heard it. So it was played late at night, or they didn't know what we were talking about. So we picked, eventually it's like a snowball. We've picked up over 60 participants, and it's radio plays, poems, political ranting, lots of playlists, because we always have a short deadline. So there's a lot of artist DJing, but some of it's really good. And it's very heterogeneous. So one night to the next, it can be really different. And they're great. There are things by artists, people you know, like Thurston Moore probably, or Lawrence Weiner or Dan Graham. And there are things by like a young artist from Dusseldorf that I would be surprised that you knew his work right now. And so, and like a young punk in Chinatown in LA, and everything in between. And there's somebody who works the front desk at a gallery. There's a New York gallerist who did it, Carol Green. So it's just all kinds of people working. And there are like 3 or 4 radio plays. There's a great radio play by a California artist named Cindy Bernard. It's a historical piece, I think from maybe the 17th century. It's about a street musician and a court musician arguing with each other, and it sounds oddly like a new music or independent person arguing with like a mainstream pop person. Tony Conrad, the composer, did a very funny radio piece or a radio play, and we're also doing a live event. And the lineup isn't finished yet, but Mark von Schlegel, a science fiction writer from the US, is going to do a radio play with atmospheric sound treatments. And the German cultural critic and historian Dietrich Dietrichson, who has published with the German magazine Spex for years, but has written really well about especially Martin Kippenberger, is going to deliver, I think, a fairly serious paper on critical methodology. And I think there's a DJ from here that specializes in field recordings of Brazilian psychedelic music. And our live act couldn't make it because she forgot she was committed to a group show someplace. So we're looking for a live musical element, and it should be fun. And it'll be broadcast live on the student radio here, but also available later on the archive. Is that a good description of radio, Danielle? Any other questions? I'll just throw something out. I have 3 rules: no plexiglass, no humor, and no electricity. Or no plexiglass, no electricity, no humor. And that's what I tell my students. That's how you can best achieve making serious art. Plexiglass gets old, it fogs, it won't be as clear 5 years from now as it is when you got the piece framed, and it scratches easily. Electricity, there's always, as you can hear, problems. Actually, that's not nice. The sound technician is very good. In fact, he invented some of the system that we're dealing with here. Electricity, if you install an installation, the minute you go to the airport, they'll turn the sound down because they don't want to listen to it, or the projector will break or something. So at least what it will take to shut down my exhibition is the electricity will have to go out in Bergen. So that I'm probably pretty safe that it will be okay. And then humor, I just don't think is a good idea in any context. But okay, so last call for questions. Okay, so enjoy the show.